Because adversity is often the breeding ground for development, dive into Neurointerventional Stories, the uncensored interviews. Our guests, all leaders in the field of neurointervention, share the difficulties they face, the complications they have had to manage, and speak without filters on little discussed, sometimes controversial, or simply taboo subjects. Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Sujijantarat again, and today I have a pleasure of sitting here with Dr. Ajay Wakhloo. He's a man who does not need introduction, but he is a professor of Tufts University School of Medicine, a CEO and CMO of Prometheus Therapeutics, who developed regenerative technology for treatment of brain aneurysms. I want to start out with a question that we ask everyone, which is that now we know you as a leader in the field. Take us before all of that. Who was Ajay Wakhloo?
I have a quite typical but interesting journey. I was born in a time in Kashmir that underwent changes due to separation of the subcontinent into Pakistan and India. So we stayed with India, and as Kashmiri, the opportunities were very low for my parents, who then migrated ultimately to Germany. So at the age of 4, I grew up in Germany. So coming from Kashmir mountains, we lived some time in the tropical parts of India, then suddenly being propelled in a society that was recovering from the Second World War. So there was a lot of energy in building, a lot of energy around engineering, and there was this sense of, with very little means, to make a great country out of Germany. Of course, there was a lot of help from the United States through the Marshall Plan, and we felt that in the school. So in this setting of, I would look back and say, poverty and challenging life, we had to make the best. I think that's very important, that later when I graduated, I was working on different things as a student, and then as a fellow in neurointervention, I was fellow at the University of Freiburg with Professor Schumacher. There was this culture in most of the academic places in Germany to dedicate your time with something exciting where you could make a dent in your field. So Professor Schumacher connected me with an inventor called Hans-Peter Strecker, the Strecker stent. And I started working with Hans-Peter. And one day I thought, well, he uses stents for dogs. He starts using in animal experiments stents. And we thought, well, we could use the stents to prevent materials we were putting in aneurysms. In those days, we were having detachable balloons and detachable coils. I'm talking about 1988, 89. That's where the journey started. I did my clinical work. Then in the night times, around 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, we would go in the same cath lab when the patients were done. We would sneak in and start doing some experimental work. I had some colleagues who would make aneurysms for me in those animal models. And then I would play around with the stents and the detachable balloons and coils. And it was an accidental finding. I saw suddenly that these aneurysms would close off after placing the stents. So I started looking deeper into that, spent some more time, and I was not an engineer, I would say, but I thought there was something very interesting happening. And I presented the data then later in 1991 at the ASNR meeting. That was back in the time where still as a foreign graduate, you would immediately get an opportunity in the United States. So I was invited by Spetzler's group to Phoenix and spend 2 years in the United States. So they asked me to keep working on my ideas, which I did. And then I had the opportunity to be invited by Nick Hopkins. He was in Buffalo. So we got along very well. For Nick, many things we were doing already as intervention neuroradiologists back in Germany were new, like carotid stenting or using liquid embolics. So all new things at that time in the United States. But since the German school was neurointervention school was very much influenced by the French school, so we knew all these materials we were exposed to. We knew the neurovascular anatomy very well, how to deal it. And it became a friendship. So there was a lot of interaction between Nick Hopkins and he promoted me a lot. I got a engineering Buswell fellowship. So I started working on this concept of using stents, and then I took undergrad classes in engineering in Buffalo at the State University of Buffalo. There was a professor who was teaching fluid mechanics. We became friends, and I showed him the concept, and he liked it. So we wrote small internal grants at the university, and then we got several NIH grants for the project, and one step led to the other. And then one of the grants was then named flow diverters for treatment of brain aneurysms, and we thought it's a very catchy name. And flow diverter was born. Of course, there was a lot of engineering that went into a lot of science and fluid mechanics, animal work, tissue work. There were other companies that got interested into that. One of the companies was Chestnut Hill, who came with a pipeline device, and that was the first one that hit the market. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of flow diversion. Now, what we saw back around early 2000 when we were working in the flow diversion, that not all aneurysm would close. Especially in the elderly population, we saw some kind of a delayed occlusion of the aneurysm, or endothelialization we call, or scarring of the saccular element or part of the aneurysm. So what we decided to do is, how can we improve the endothelialization, the scarring, the healing of the aneurysm? At that time, there was a researcher who was working in the field of photothrombosis. The gentleman was trying to, at the University of Miami then, was trying to create white clot by using laser light in conjunction with some other drugs. So Barry Lieber, who then had joined me and who was the professor in engineering in Buffalo, with whom I used to work on the flow diverter, he joined me. I asked him to come down to University of Miami, where I was then after leaving Nick Hopkins in Buffalo. He came down, we started working on the concept, and what we found out was that aneurysms were healing earlier, and they were showing something inside the aneurysm sac that no pathologist understood. So we took then a deeper dive over the next decades, and what was happening was that the laser light that we were using to create for thrombosis of the aneurysm was in fact stimulating precursor cells or dormant cells in the aneurysm vessel wall, but also in the parent artery. And now we know that certain wavelengths and energy dose stimulate the proliferation and the differentiation of cells that are positive for alpha smooth muscle cell act, as well as CD31. So there is a battery of cells that are residing in the vessel wall and in the aneurysm wall to do the repair. The unfortunate thing is that with age, we lose the reparative function because these cells become sparse over time, and also the motility changes, the capability of differentiation changes. That's why younger people, for example, pediatric population, heals dissections of an artery much faster than us. So there is an intrinsic build in for aging. And with the light, we saw in our preclinical data that it's shifting that response. So we are making out of a lazy system in situ through activation with laser something more proliferative, more responsive. There are examples for laser light. For example, capillary hemangiomas, plastic surgeons use that, birthmarks, they use it. Now they do fine needling for wrinkles with lasers to improve the healing of collagen. So laser is being used in the cosmetic industry for a while and in the plastic industry.
There's so many things I want to unpack from your story, so I'm going to go kind of chronologically. My first question that I wanted to ask was, you talked about growing up in the environment that's clearly very unique. I wanted to ask, how do you think being in that environment and growing up in different places, being influenced by the education of different countries that you were in, how did that shape your experience today? And now your name has become synonymous with flow diverter. How do you think those early days of experience made you today?
I think this is a very interesting question, Nan. And for you, it must be similar because you have also a brilliant career. You started in a different part of the world and now you're in the United States. So you know well it means the sacrifices we have to make because we believe in what we are doing. And I think perseverance on this journey is very important. I think it is important to be open-minded, to be an observant. And I have to say, coming from a country that was in shambles after the war, I'm talking about India or Kashmir, there was nothing. Coming then, or being propelled to a country that is high in technology, is in a phase to build and reform the whole system. That's Germany. it was like clashes of two worlds. And as a child, we absorbed that. As a child, you are super curious, and if you have creative mind and you let it go, that was great stimulant for me, for my brain. And I have an identical twin brother who is an architect. He has a lot of parallelity with me. So you see, the environment is important to get the best out of you. Of course, you have to let go. You have to be open-minded. You have to be tolerant towards your environment and towards yourself and towards your thinking. And I think it was very important. And I think that the United States then, after listening to me, invited me to further do research here, shows open-minded systems are important for our innovative field. I think it's critical.
So aside from flow diversion, you were also involved in multiple really kind of fascinating new technologies. And we'll go into, the most recent thing, which I'm really excited to talk about. But you've been a part of minimally invasive endocisternal bioelectronics, which was just published last year with Dr. Peter Kahn, and then also neurotherapeutic drug delivery platform. For those of us who may not be familiar with these topics, can you give a 30,000-foot view of these topics and how you see them being incorporated into the future practice?
Yeah, so my chairman in neurosurgery back at the University of Freiburg, Professor Sager, used to tell me something that has stuck with my brain. He says neurosurgery is like removing the yellow of the egg, the yolk, through the white without damaging the white. And I think that's where medicine is going. Minimal therapy is finding the easiest paths to the site of treatment without damaging the structures around it. So the example you mentioned, the endocisternal approach, was born out of an idea that goes back to Phil Purdy. Phil Purdy, a neuroradiologist from Dallas, introduced way back, I think it was in early 90s. How can we travel using catheter-based systems through the cerebrospinal fluid system, lumbar, like when you do myelography, you could basically enter the intrathecal space minimally invasively and then track under fluoroscopy or imaging the systems up to the brain. He wanted to clip aneurysm from outside, on and on. So there was a whole thinking behind it. At that time, due to fundraising issues, he stopped the project. But later we picked it up at UMass, and then we used it to deliver for certain degenerative disorders like Tay-Sachs disease and ALS, adeno-associated viruses, into the cistern. We wanted a higher concentration in the basal cistern, pediatric population. So we went translumbar, and they had an NIH grant, FDA approval for all the procedure. And we went with a microcatheter and a fluoroscopy in the pediatric population. And we succeeded. So then, of course, we had done animal studies before that, on and on and on. And then we thought, how can we take it to the next level? So the idea of doing third ventriculostomy for occlusive hydrocephalus was born. So we started working on systems, and the CSF space is different than the vascular space in many reasons. But the bottom line was the systems that we were using in the vascular did not work for the intrathecal system. So we designed over the past several years now systems that allow us to travel through the translumbar axis inside the center of the brain and do a third ventriculostomy for occlusive disease. And in collaboration with Dr. Peter Kahn, they took it to the next level. They used the axis and fluoroscopy and imaging to implant sensors on the surface of the brain. We think this is the next frontier in the nervous system, where we can either through the vascular approach, like Dr. Luis Savastano is showing us, through transvenous access or through an endocisternal access, do neuromodulation, pain therapy, surgeries even of certain structures, biopsies. So the field is endless. We're just scratching it, and that's what we do at D&D. We are creating an endocisternal approach.
What's your next project?
As you may have heard, that TCAR was born out of the interest of placing a carotid stent through opening the carotid artery in the neck and placing a stent directly in the carotid artery. So that's done by vascular surgeons. But there's a large group of neurosurgeons, neurologists, and intervention neuroradiologists who are faced with challenges when they do acute stroke. Middle of the night, they cannot access the brain fast enough, or sometimes not at all, through a femoral access or through a radial access. They use many catheters, it delays, and as you know, time is brain. So what we said, how do we get it faster? So you may not know that, but when I was trained, I was your age, when I was trained in treating brain diseases through the vascular approach, we used to do about 600 direct carotid punctures every year, whether it was for an epidural, bleed, tumors, pituitary tumors, glioblastoma, aneurysms, you name it. The reason was the CAT scanners were not available. They were still at very early phase. There was no MRI. So the problem was when we used to treat aneurysms through the neck, we had to close that. And most of the time we would hold pressure and create hematomas in the neck and whatnot with all the complications. Or we would send the patients for vascular surgeons to suture the carotid artery. So we thought 5-6 years ago, can we do a percutaneous, the same way, percutaneous access to the carotid artery, to the common carotid artery, and develop an intelligent closure system that anybody can use? And that's what we have solved. We have done the first patients already successfully. So we do believe that we can, in very near future, do carotid stenting with flow reversal by direct stick. We can do access to the brain through a direct stick without harming our hands also in the fluoroscopy unit. Of course, you don't want to be having your hands in the fluoro unit. So we have designed systems that allow you then at the end of the procedure to close safely the carotid artery. So it's an auto knot system that's easy to be used by anybody in this field.
With the idea being the closure is much more reliable than what we have today.
Yeah, it has to be 100%.
Yeah, it has to be.
Yes.
Yeah. What advice do you have for young physicians on innovation? How to develop the mindset for it, how to nurture it, and how to carry it through?
I have a fundamental driving motto for myself since I was young. If you know it's not good enough, don't settle for less. I think it's important that you push yourself. I know it comes at a very high cost. But what it does is, it really, we are here in Paris, so Roland Garros is going on. When you see these tennis players, they really play one ball after the other. And I think as a young person, my suggestion would be, do not worry about things like, where will I be in a few years? Do we have enough money? All these fear and worries will truncate your creativity. I think creativity, of course, is born out of a need. And when you are desperate, the mind can come up with creative solutions. But you have to take time out of your clinical setting, out of your daily practice, maybe when you are in the bicycle on home or in the car, thinking what you did. And think about putting yourself in the patient. What is it that the patient may have felt what you did today? How can I eliminate some of the pain, some of discomfort? So when you start changing basically the chair with the patient and start thinking about that perspective, you will be surprised how many doors will open up for creativity, for new ideas. Because as a doctor, we are always very excited. As young doctors, we want to do the best. But often we catch ourselves doing for ourselves the best. And I think it would be important to switch the role. The older I, for example, I'm now more thinking to be an advocate of a patient's rather than my own. That takes time. But for the young people, just try to change the role. Personally, I'm often asked, for example, should I do first an engineering because I'm very creative, I have a mind of a researcher. Should I do that first and then do my residency, or should I do first residency and then do business or create a company? It's very difficult to say what is right for one or the other person. But my own history has been the brain, when it's young, absorbs faster, quicker, and is really ready to assimilate everything. The older you get, the more difficult. It's not impossible, but it gets more difficult. So you have to prime your brain, and I would suggest for the younger crowd to be in a very academic environment where there are your peers who have ideas, so interact with them, share ideas. I would go the route of academic world, do your residency, be exposed to patient management, treatment, and then go the route of creating companies and doing business. Because that part, believe it or not, is the most boring part. The most exciting part is doing medicine, being with the patients, the moment you come out of the OR and the family member or the patient gives you a hug, that is something you will never forget. And that's why we are here in the end, really.
At the end of the podcast, we ask the same 3 questions to everybody. So the first question is, if you have to choose 2 people who have been the most influential in your career, who would they be and why?
I think Buddha has impressed me a lot. Whatever I know, because I never met him, so he's through reading. I think that his teachings and how he sees life is very touching. I think that that's very important for me. Professionally for me was Professor Weigand. He was an intervention radiologist who was initially a surgeon, became an intervention radiologist, and used to do with enormous skill set the most challenging treatment at a time where people were hesitant. I can tell you, he one day opened up the whole belly under conscious at local anesthesia. They used to put a catheter transhepatic for liver cancer treatment. So before they went to surgery, liver surgery, he would put that for them. And one day he opened up whole omentum, everything, because the umbilical cord was so atrophied, so he couldn't go through the vein. So everything ripped, and I could see the gallbladder, and the patient was awake, and half the abdomen was open. And we're talking about 40 plus years ago. I told him if the patient would have a problem, we could take the gallbladder out. And he said, what do you think how we used to do that? So that was impressive from learning in my field. But I have to say, Buddha was for me in overall shaping who I am today. And I'm not a Buddhist. I come from family from Hindus, and I'm not religious. I'm not spiritual, but it is so humanistic. It is so irreligious. It is just a path and a way of living. And I think that makes it so unique.
If we fast forward 10 to 15 years, how do you imagine the field would look like?
First of all, I think that things don't move as fast as we want and we think. So in my experience, everything takes much longer. But with the current capabilities in machine learning, in robotics, micromachinery, tool manufacturing, understanding of the brain, it's advancing fairly rapidly. I see that in 10, 15 years from now, we will utilize as physicians all these items to support our capability. We will be more efficient. I think AI will make us more efficient. I think that the level of education will rise. I think the knowledge of physicians will rise overall. So it's more a democratization of knowledge for the benefit, of course, of our patients. And it's also good to see, like here at Link Meeting, that we have representation from all around the world. Parts where what we do, minimal invasive in the neurovascular field, was practically not existing 15, 20 years ago. And now you see so much excitement. And I think that speed of transformation of the medicine we are doing, whether it's stroke management, whether it's going into the CSF space, will become more globally available. I think that's one thing, globalization, a democratization of knowledge in our field also, and more efficient safety will increase. When I was trained, angiography had a risk of 10%, and intervention had a risk of 30-40%, something going wrong. Today they talk about 1, 2, 3%. So that's impressive advancement. So robotics, AI will help us definitely. That's the future. Imaging in our field is being more and more incorporated in what we do, and it will become like flying a plane. It will be like a cockpit experience. Do any of us think when we board a plane today that we won't make it? No. And that same feeling will happen to the patient. The patient will go into the room and come out with the feeling, well, the risk was minimal, nominal. So that's where I see that happening.
I was just thinking, we used to ask this question, what do you think was the most revolutionizing technology that's happened to our field? And a lot of them will say flow diversion. Did you know 10 to 15 years ago that flow diversion would be such a revolutionizing treatment in the field?
No. Not at all. I started with this project back in 88, 89 in Freiburg. thinking it's interesting to do something creative, different. We never were thinking, well, one day this will be used for 20, 30, 40% of aneurysm. That was never in my mind. I wouldn't say. I didn't think about that.
And it goes along with the concept of what you said too. It's democratization of the field, where it's taking the treatment that used to be a lot more complex and making it much more accessible to people at all skills level by not having to enter the aneurysm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like taking a drug. Of course, there's a difference in biological response, pharmacokinetic and all that. But taking a pill is so atraumatic to most of us. And I think that's how this will gradually grow into. That it will be so minuscule, the injury to the tissue where we enter to fix other problems, that the risk will be averted. It will be a less fearful experience.
And the last question is, what is the one thing you would advise our trainee to do today to make them a more successful and better interventionalist in the future?
I think training models like adopted for pilots, where they do cockpit training, simulators. I think simulated training will be very helpful to make good doctors. We have the tools now and they're getting better and better. Some of them have even haptic feedback. The reason I'm saying that is because the number of physicians are growing. The number of procedures per physician is also growing, but there's a variability of the procedures. So when I was trained, there were probably 3-4 diseases you would treat, and a center would treat over 100 aneurysms, 120, 130, 200 aneurysms a year. Today, some centers treat 15, 20 aneurysms a year, but they do other things. They do stroke. So because the disease entities are so variable, the same person has to do probably one day endocisternal ventriculostomy or a carotid stick. So we need to come up with modules, training modules to fix those problems. That training should be improved. And there are companies who are working on training modules and all that. It's like, when I have a damage today in the house, I don't call always a plumber. I go to YouTube and look at the video 3-4 times, and then I say, I figured it out. Now, you may say, well, I will never come to your house because everything may break apart. But you see, there's a lot of things that we can learn with the modern technology that's available in education. So
it's been a pleasure talking to you today, Dr. Wakhloo. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Nat. It was a pleasure.